Hey, that's a cool background.
Thank you. Uh, it is apropos, it's a page from a Heliand manuscript. So,
I really like that Carolingian not Carolingian insular, just plain Carolingian minuscule.
yeah,
It's such a clear, beautiful hand.
yep.
Well, sorry, I'm like 1 minute late. I got behind just the wrong person in the canyon there. But it is such a privilege to have you on here. We've been talking about doing an interview for quite a while now. I think since
Yes,
we reconnected in person in Athens 2 years ago.
yes, yeah. And I apologize. The delay was mostly mine for a while, but I'm glad it can happen now, and it's a great honor to me to be part of your what you do. It's quite extraordinary. I think this is probably the most people I've talked to on this sort of thing in a long time. So if probably, I mean, if you post it on your channel, it'll probably be the biggest audience I would ever have on this.
Oh, I'm going to post it on my channel because people ask me about Old Saxon all the time. The thing is, with Old Germanic languages, Old Norse is actually in a pretty good position, right? There's
Yes.
enough people that are interested in it. Plus, you have the you have the Iceland factor that you don't really have like an Iceland with something
Yeah.
like Old Saxon or Old English. Um, so I don't know. I think it's great, and I'd love to have you back to talk about more of this stuff. And I promise you, the people who are here live with us are going to be interested in this too. Let me just say we are joined today by Professor Alex Sager of the University of Georgia, who I've known since 2006, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here to talk to us today in particular about Old Saxon. And I thought that what we might get you to do to start with is just give us kind of a précis of what is Old Saxon? What do we mean by that term? How would you situate it among the Germanic languages more broadly? And what evidence do we have of Old Saxon?
Yeah. So, first of all, just a disclaimer here. I am not a linguist. I am a literature scholar. I've done enough linguistics to allow me to, of course, read the texts and to understand them and to communicate the essentials of linguistics, linguistic state of affairs of Old Saxon to a few students that I've had on Old Saxon over the years. I work a little bit more on Old High German. So I don't really here. I consulted my colleague Joshua Busquet, whom you know as well.
Mhm.
So on some of these things. So Old Saxon was the language spoken in Northern Europe. Would be east of the Rhine and north of Thuringia at the time, and to the west of the Saxon tribes, who at that time were far further to the west in Northern Europe than they are now, or they would be a few centuries later. So it is a predecessor to Old Low German. It is rather similar to Dutch in certain ways. It is a language that did not participate in what we call the second German sound shifts, or the Lautverschiebung, the second German Lautverschiebung. So instead of a word like das, right, the das Haus or something like that, the Old Saxon word would be dat or that, right? So in that sense, it's a little bit more I guess, archaic or a little bit more conservative. That was also one of the questions you sent me. How do we describe this language linguistically in terms of, is it more innovative or conservative? So it would be on the conservative side of things in many ways, especially with regard to consonants. It is quite similar to Old English. I mean, it's very closely related to Old English. There's a lot of communication between Franconia, the Frankish Empire, where the old Saxon peoples were at that time, and the Anglo-Saxon world, the Old English world. Many Old English missionaries, many Anglo-Saxon missionaries are working on the continent at that time and had been for decades prior. So there's a very interesting story about a particular text that we know originated in the Saxon areas that was then translated into Old English. Perhaps we can get into that later. It's a very interesting text related to the Heliand, but it is not the Heliand. So
the Genesis, right?
That's the Old Saxon Genesis, yeah, which not many people know about. Most people have heard of the Heliand. That's the big Old Saxon text. There are a few fragments of earlier biblical material from the Genesis, Book of Genesis, which I've worked on. I've not actually published anything on the Heliand, but I have published on the Old Saxon Genesis, and so perhaps we can get into that later.
Yeah, I'd like to. And could you also, because I think it's such a central factor in talking about Old Saxon, could you give us just a quick précis of what the Heliand is?
Yeah, the Heliand is essentially the gospel story told in Old Saxon. It is a massive thing. It's nearly 6,000 lines long, written in alliterative verse. So if you know Beowulf, it's a verse form related to the very same verse form that we see in the Old English Beowulf. It's somewhat different in certain ways. We can get into that a little bit later, but it's the same alliterative verse poetry, which we find in many old Germanic texts in the early Middle Ages. The Heliand is the gospel story. It is a so-called gospel harmony. Now, as those of you who know Christianity know that there are 4 gospels, and they all tell the story of Jesus in slightly different ways. 3 of them are more closely related to each other. That would be Mark, Matthew, and Luke than any of those 3 are to John. There's all kinds of interesting little discrepancies between the Gospels. And so in the early Christian era, the need for a kind of a harmonization of the entire gospel story was seen as necessary primarily for missionary purposes. So it's a gospel harmony. It is based on a gospel harmony that was translated into Old High German in the 9th century called the Tatian. And it tells the story of Jesus in a way that unifies the narratives of all the Gospels based on a source text. So it's the story of Jesus's life and death. And it was used, this was also a question that you sent me, it was very much used in the process of missionizing the Saxons, which between about 770 and sometime in the early 9th century were converted to Christianity in a long and very drawn out, very, very difficult process. Yeah.
Yeah, the specific question you're referring to there, I think, is this one. If Ludwig the Pious commissioned the Heliand, was it part of the difficult process of Christianizing the Saxons?
Absolutely, yeah. That is certainly the case, yeah.
Well, actually, let's get to some of those other questions now, because that was a good segue into it. Because there was another question about Heliand that came right after that, which was, if the author of Heliand knew Cadman, did he get his education in England? I would say this first question is, did the author of Heliand know Cadman?
No.
Or at the court of Charlemagne with his English scholars?
Yeah, very good question. There is a Cadman connection, but he could not have known Cadman. Cadman is writing in the late 7th century, and the Heliand poet is working in the early 800s. So at least a century lies between them. There can be no, they can't have known each other, and they would not have been alive nearly at the same time. You know, Bede himself, who gives the narrative concerning Cadman, dies in 735, almost a century before the Heliand was composed. Now, the Cadman connection is the following. We have a Latin preface that is associated with the Heliand. And in this Latin preface, we learn something about how the Heliand was written. And we learn that an Old Saxon poet who came from a rural, sort of a rustic background, was inspired by God to tell the biblical story. And this may sound familiar to those of us who know the Cadman story. That's exactly the Cadman story, right? And the idea here is that those who commissioned the Heliand saw they were people who were probably, several of them anyway, were probably from the Anglo-Saxon world. This is seen as happening in the monastery at Fulda. That's the I wouldn't say there's some disagreement as to where the Heliand was written or commissioned. The monastery at Fulda is probably where it was. Bede's texts are transmitted there. We have the Cadman story is in the Fulda library going back to the early Middle Ages. And so the thought is that those who commissioned the Heliand knew the Bede story, knew the Cadman story, and kind of cast the commissioning of the Heliand very much in those terms. Now, there probably was an old Saxon poet, or there was a group of poets. It's not quite certain as to who this poet was, but he is seen in there are direct quotes from that Bede passage concerning Cadman in that preface to the Heliand, and so that would be the Cadman connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes perfect sense. I mean, whether or not it's exactly how a poem like that came together, and it's hard to say. I mean, it's such a long, ambitious, well-constructed work that it's a little hard to think of it coming together that spontaneously. But
right, yeah, what the authorship, the conditions of authorship for the Heliands are very much contested. The opinions range from something like he was a Cadman-like figure who was the preface describes him as someone who was he was a well-known poet in the Saxon world in a traditional context, which means possibly that he knew all the old heroic poetry. I mean, we're right at the end of the pagan era, so he may have known all the traditional heroic poetry of the Saxons during their pagan phase, and during the conversion, the missionary, the Carolingian mission saw it as a very good move to have the gospel story told in this old language, in this old medium, in the old settings, is a way of kind of outreach to a population that was finding it very, very difficult to convert to the new religion, that was beholden in many ways to the old gods and the old rituals. And so what better way of convincing them than to tell them a gospel story, which in certain, I would say, external ways resembles the old literary tradition in certain ways. So, for example, Jesus is described as a theoden, right? A leader of the people. His disciples are very much the war band, right? The comitatus. This language is very, very dense throughout the Heliand. Now, the message concerning, say, violence and warfare and revenge taking and boasting and things like that is completely different, right? It is essentially the Christian message. But the externals, right, the relationship between Jesus and his disciples is kind of traditional in certain ways, as are many other aspects of the story.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what kind of analogy you could make to something today. I feel like, it's as if someone had some grand new philosophy or religion they were trying to convert the people of 2024 America to, and they commissioned some, they commissioned Taylor Swift to write a Taylor Swift song about it, right? Like, let's get the people they're already listening to and the way they're already listening to them.
Yeah.
Get them to deliver it. Right? And, it's funny because I feel like it's a little off topic for this question, but I feel like there's actually some weird misconceptions about Heliand that float around out there. You hear people talk about it as this, it's Christ as Beowulf, which is not quite true. It's more like the Beowulf poet talking about Christ. Yeah, because you don't get that same sense of violence that you would get out of something like Beowulf or the Volsung material, right? But it's still pretty.
This is one of the things that Heliand spends a lot of time talking about is emphasizing how violence is not a solution, right? The most famous episode is when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. You may remember, those of you who know the Bible know that Peter whips out his sword and hacks off the ear of one of the servants of one of the people who's come to arrest him, and then Jesus reprimands him. It takes about 2 or 3 lines in the Bible. Well, this is a whole huge thing in the Heliand, right? There's a long description of how Simon Peter sees his Lord being arrested, and he falls into a kind of a warrior rage, and he whips out his sword, and there's like 10 lines is spent on his disposition and the act of cutting off the ear. And then a very, very long passage where Jesus tells him that this is not how we do things, right? This is not the way to do it. And he sets him straight. So it is that episode, I think rightly so, is seen as the audience possibly will have been warriors who dealt with conflict in the old Germanic way, right? With fighting to the death and vengeance. And they're being told here, no, they're being, on the one hand, they feel seen, right? They feel seen with this kind of story, right? Mm-hmm. They see themselves, they identify themselves with a character like Simon Peter, but on the other hand, they're told that this is not the way we can do things anymore. And
you give them something to relate to without berating them about it. And
right.
Yeah, it is well done.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, the attitude reminds me a little bit of the attitude of Snorri in the prologue to the Prose Edda, where the pre-Christian ways are described not as evil. It's just like, oh, well, they didn't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, exactly. Now that particular attitude where Snorri says, they didn't know, he cuts them a little bit of slack. He sees things in I wouldn't say culturally relativistic terms, but he understands that they came from a very different place. There's a certain sort of respect and accommodation of the old tradition, right? Mm-hmm. Now that attitude did not, that was a very, very hard-won attitude. That was an attitude that did not initially prevail in the early stages of the Carolingian mission, right? The early stages in the 770s, 780s, 790s, it was a very brutal mission. And the voices from Charlemagne's court were very much like, no, these are demon worshipping, these are demon worshippers, and they all need to be treated very, 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 very harshly. The first legislation dealing with converted Saxony says things like, well, if you don't go to church, you pay with it with your life, right? If you abuse a priest, you die. I mean, extremely draconian legislation. This is called the first Saxon capitulary, right? Now, that simply didn't work. I mean, there was a lot of revolts and things like that. It's only in the 830s, 840s that the mission saw, well, we have to take a softer approach. And the Heliand probably comes out of that second phase, right? We need to accommodate to a certain extent the Saxons in their difficult transition to this whole new way of being in the world, this whole new religion. But originally that was not the approach.
And I guess that also means that it's not necessarily a first generation converts work, but rather it's a few generations into the project of.
Yeah. Now the dating is another difficult question. One of you had sent a question along about the dating, and you mentioned Louis the Pious. There are actually two theories that Louis could be Louis the Pious, right? Charlemagne's son, or it could be Louis the German, right? His son, right? Who comes a generation later. So I would say probably the consensus is that Louis the Pious is the one who's talked about. Now, the Louis the Pious's name is mentioned in that preface to the Heliand that I was talking about earlier. But it could be Louis the German. It could be, the earliest possible date that it could have been written was 820, because we have evidence that a particular biblical commentary that was written in 820 is referred to in the Heliand. Now, if it's Louis the Pious, who was the commissioner, he died in 840, I believe. So between 820 and 840, Louis the German lives, I think, into the 860s. And so it could be 840, 850, 860, sometime in there as well. Now, the conversion really took many decades. So it could be Louis the German as well. It doesn't really matter so much, but the conversion was a very drawn out process, and there was still resistance in the 840s. We know that there was a revolt in the 840s called the Stellinga Revolt, where it is said that the people revolting wanted to return to the old customs and the old ways. So.
Fjell veit eg freda fram seg lengra.
Well, and I mean, even in something like Beowulf, you see that in perhaps roughly contemporary England, there's awareness of the idea that people
Yeah.
could slide back.
Yeah.
And speaking of that English connection, segue to another question here. Could a speaker of Old Saxon read Old English? What about Old Norse?
Yeah. Um, well, we know that a speaker of Old English could read Old Saxon because this Old Saxon Genesis text that we were talking about earlier, that is an originally Old Saxon text that was imported to the British Isles and translated into Old Saxon in a way that Old English, in a way that a 19th century scholar could detect the fact that it was a translation from an Old Saxon text. I can talk a little bit more about that later. That's a very interesting story about how these texts were discovered. Now, Old English is a language that has certain changes vis-a-vis Old Saxon, like the palatalization of the initial velar consonants and a lot more umlauts and a much richer vocabulary, at least that we know about, right? Because there are many, many more Old English or Anglo-Saxon texts transmitted than Old Saxon texts. So I don't really know about, this whole question of mutual intelligibility is very difficult. I mean, if we're talking about learned monks who specialize in languages and who listen patiently while speakers speak, I think probably there was could be understood. I just don't know. I have no evidence about Old Saxon speakers speaking Old English. We do know, as I mentioned before, that there were Old English monks or Anglo-Saxon monks operating in the Christian mission. We know that they were one of the reasons that Anglo-Saxons were so successful in missionizing on the continent was because they had these linguistic abilities, right? They could communicate to many different Germanic peoples, not simply the Old Saxons. I mean, they went all over the place, right? In many places in Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Anglo-Saxon monks worked all over, and we presume that they could handle these languages very well, and they could make themselves understood. Now, I just don't. I couldn't. I would imagine that a good speaker of Old Saxon, or a learned speaker of Old Saxon, or say a monk, an Old Saxon person who was converted to Christianity and worked in the monasteries there. We do know they existed, right? There's some names we name. We know they probably could understand Old Saxon. I would say yes. Now, Old Norse, I simply don't know. I know that you've done a couple of podcasts where you actually speak your interlocutors. You kind of do little dialogues, right? Is this true with like Old Norse and Old English? Are they mutually intelligible? I would say if Old Norse and Old English are mutually intelligible, do you have an answer to that question?
Well, I have a relative answer to this. I think Old English and Old Saxon, yeah, I think it would be extremely easy for a speaker of one to recognize what the speaker of the other was saying, especially after a couple ground things
Yeah,
were understood, like the palatalization.
yeah,
I think with Old Norse, it's there's more of a gap, right? And I think that one of the biggest things is just the endings are different enough, especially in the verb, that I think that like maybe if you stuck to something really, really basic, like in the level of just roots, you could probably communicate better than if you were trying to speak all the endings. I don't know. Like,
yeah,
but I think that it wouldn't take you that long to learn. I think it would be a matter of
right,
exposure over weeks and months rather than and adjusting rather than just learning a whole new language.
right.
But Old English and Old Saxon, absolutely. I think that's probably like Norwegian Swedish in terms of mutual intelligibility.
Right. One of our viewers, the Pike Spy, asks. He notes, I'd assume spoken Latin might have been involved in communication between the island missionaries and the continental folks. I mean, that's absolutely the case, but only on the level of the Anglo-Saxon missionaries dealing with the already Christianized missionaries of Germanic origin on the continent. They would have spoken in Latin. They were all essentially masters of spoken Latin. That would have been their major language of communication. Maybe they would have done a little bit of vernacular if they could, but primarily they would be speaking with each other in Latin. But when it came to the mission in the field, out with the people, Latin, things had to be translated into the vernacular because the people in the villages and the little hamlets did not speak Latin. And there are actually interesting stories. We hear about these in the letters of Boniface, the 8th century missionary to the Germanic peoples, that even the priests who were left behind or who were operating in the little villages in Germania, they didn't even know Latin all that well, right? And they would make terrible mistakes in Latin. And Boniface wrote to the Pope and said, "Hey, are the mistakes that are being made by our priests in the villages in Latin, are they going to compromise the efficacy of the sacraments?" Right? Because I think there's a very famous example in one of the letters where some priest in some little hamlet in Bavaria, I think, was saying, in the name of the father and of the daughter and of the, right, he got filius and filia confused. And this was a question that Boniface had to ask the Pope. And the Pope was like, "Hey, it's not really all that important, right? The important thing is, do they understand the message, right?" So Latin was useful in the administrative structure, but not in the out in the woods in the backcountry.
Right, and you'd want your homilies to be in the vernacular always.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, Carol, the missionary. Charlemagne was very, very concerned about this communicative aspect of the missionary, and he was like, the people need to be able to understand the Christian message in their own language, in their own vernacular language, and then we can build on that.
Mm-hmm. There was a question here that I think we've dealt with. I'll read it though if you want to add anything about it. The Heliand was written in the early 9th century after the Saxon Wars, when the Saxon nobles supported Christianity and common people were revolting against the new religion. It was written in the style of heroic poems, which seem aimed at the nobility. Would they have been the intended audience, or would it have been an attempt to make it more acceptable to the Saxons in general?
It's definitely a noble audience, right? The mission was very much directed at the nobility and not so much at the common people. The questioner seems to be aware of some of there's this 840s revolt that I was talking about, the Stellinga revolt. The Stellinga, this was definitely a bit of class warfare, right? The Stellinga were lower class people, farmers and village people, essentially, non-members of the nobility, who felt that they were being completely left out of the process. And Charlemagne's mission was very much aimed at co-opting the nobility, right? And so, yeah, the form and the language of the Heliand in the Old Saxon Genesis it's about warriors and war bands and the way the female character is represented also tells us that we're talking about members of the nobility. And the word ethel or adel is very, very common throughout these texts. As a matter of fact, one aspect that the Heliand poet really emphasizes vis-a-vis the gospel even is the nobility of Jesus's lineage descending from David. Right now, that of course is from the Gospels. But the Heliand poet really, really emphasizes that, because he wants these Saxon nobles to understand that Jesus is not some common person, right? Because, of course, the Christian message is for everybody, irrespective of class. And we do get that in the Heliand, but simultaneously, there's a very much an attempt made to make sure that people understand that Jesus himself came from kingly blood, right?
Well, and that's so much a part of legitimizing heroes in the old tradition, too.
Yes. Yeah.
So it makes sense that that's just continuity with that tradition. Absolutely. That cultural obsession.
Yes, exactly.
Another question that was right in there. Are there any contemporary non-Saxon commentaries on the Heliand that say whether they approve of the many liberties taken with the biblical texts, or if they saw it as a good way to spread Christianity? On the one hand, early Christianity seemed quite happy to adapt the midwinter festivities into Christmas, but on the other hand, Bede made a big thing out of something seemingly trivial like the calculation of Easter.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The only commentary that we have about the Heliand is this prefatio, this preface that I mentioned earlier, which describes how the poem came about and the engagement of this poet. Now, this text it's a Latin text, maybe 2 or 3 manuscript pages long. It was transmitted independently of any Heliand manuscripts, right? So we don't know precisely when it originated. it represents Latin in an old style, and a little bit of the vocabulary shows us that it was written right around the time that the Heliand was composed. It's not like it was long thought that it was a humanist, sort of a forgery or an attempt, as you know, that from the early modern period, there were many attempts to kind of go back and pretend or write a text in the old style and pretend that it came out of the early Middle Ages. Well, this really was written in the 9th century. That's all we know. There's no other reference to this text or to Old Saxon literature, vernacular literature, in the all the Latin texts of the time, the historical chronicles, the saints' lives. It's hard to find evidence of that. Now, as for the many liberties taken, this is kind of a central question about Heliand scholarship. To what extent were liberties taken? What kinds of liberties were taken? I would say that the best word to describe the liberties taken would be a word called accommodation, which means that in certain superficial ways, I would say, there is an attempt to make the setting of the gospel stories very much resemble, I would say, Northern Europe, right? I already mentioned that Jesus and the disciples are seen as kind of the Theoden and his thanes, right? This kind of warband, even though the message of the gospel is absolutely not that, right? So that's an external accommodation to a sociological reality, but when it comes to the moral reality, that is entirely Christian. Mm-hmm. Similarly, right, the Bible is set in Judea, in a desert country, and Heliand is set in the forests, in the green fields of Northern Europe. Another episode that is always referred to in this context is the story of the birth of Jesus, right? In the Bible, shepherds guarding the flocks of sheep by night, sheep and goats. In the Heliand, it is horse wardens, right? People guarding the horses. There's a lot of emphasis on scenes in festive halls, very much like the mead hall, right? The wedding at Cana. A few other episodes like that. Those are told with great relish, right? So these are kind of like, I would say, superficial accommodations, but no real liberties are taken with, I would say, the moral core of the Christian message. This was long misunderstood. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you can find claims, especially on the cultural right, about how we're dealing with a syncretic text. And what we really have here is a kind of Germanic Christianity, which upholds the warrior ethos, right? That's not true. If you read the text carefully and you look at violence, right, how Jesus talks about violence and the message with regard to violence, it is entirely one of pacifism and the renunciation of vengeance taking, the renunciation of boasting about one's heroic deeds and one's exploits on the battlefield. So that was misunderstood. I would say that there are no real liberties taken with a core aspect of the Christian message in the Heliand. It is all more external accommodation. Mm-hmm. Now, if I might, the Old Saxon Genesis is slightly different. And this is something I know about because I've written a couple articles on it. I do think that the Old Saxon Genesis, which tells the story of Adam and Eve, the first episode of the Old Saxon Genesis, tells the story of the apple, the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and evil. And I think you can make a claim that this is kind of an attempt to downplay kind of a hardcore Augustinian notion of what original sin was, right? And that we don't really have the doctrine of original sin as it came to be defined by Augustine in the early Middle Ages, whereby, Adam and Eve sinned and they transferred this fallen moral condition onto human posterity. That you don't really have in the Old Saxon Genesis. You have a kind of a way of working around that. And I've written 2 articles on that. If anyone's interested in that, probably lead too far afield and too far into theology to get into that here. But so that would be an attempt to change, I think, a bit of Christian theology. But there were debates on the precise nature of original sin among the theologians of the 7th and 8th and 9th centuries. So it's really not that surprising that you'd have a text written for vernacular folks that doesn't quite transmit original sin in a way that Augustine would have approved.
Sure, sure. And we also know from how much they obsessed about it that there are all kinds of heresies of different degrees
Yeah,
in the Middle Ages.
absolutely.
So it could
Yeah,
easily come out of something that at some point could be considered heretical.
right.
But yeah, I think the way you put it, that yeah, the late 19th century, early 20th century, that cultural right definitely is always looking for, signs of the true Germanic spirit or something in these things.
Yeah.
Uh, the fact is, it comes from a cultural moment that's not that similar to the late 19th century, early 20th century, and its
Right.
needs. But I also like how you put it about accommodation. It's just like when we set a movie in a different period than the book that it's based on was written in, right? It's just like setting Romeo and Juliet in 1996 Los Angeles, right? It's just updating a setting but keeping the core of the story the same.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, just look at go into an art museum and just look at how the biblical story has been represented across the years. There's always an attempt to accommodate the story to the time and the place of the painter. Now, that of course does stop, right? You don't find contemporary artists representing the Holy Family and the Holy Story in modern Western Europe, for example. In the modern world, there's a kind of there's a place that stops, right? And that is not done anymore with this particular story for interesting reasons, perhaps. But although, I mean, if you go to any church, say a mega church, there's, the preacher is definitely going to be, relating the story of Jesus to everything going on in one's modern life these days, right? They're on a discursive level. That kind of accommodation happens all the time.
Yeah, and I used to live and still visit very often the Northern Arapaho Reservation in Wyoming, and at St. Stephen's Mission, which is a Catholic church, the Stations of the Cross are all done in an Arapaho style with
Yeah.
Jesus and the other figures depicted as Arapahoes in traditional clothing, and the Holy Spirit as an eagle, and
Yeah.
so this sort of thing. The Catholic Church has often been willing to make that kind of accommodation in reaching new populations.
That does remind me of one. You mentioned the eagle. That does remind me of one other little bit of accommodation. Now, in the story where Jesus is being baptized, you and folks in your audience may remember that in the Bible, a dove appears in heaven and settles down, I think, on Jesus' head or shoulder like that. In the Heliand, it's seen as a mighty bird, right, that comes down, right? So that's a bird that perhaps is associated with someone like Odin or Thor or something like that. A kingly bird. A dove was not seen as maybe transmitting the kind of the not being really a good cultural symbol for a Germanic male warrior audience, or yeah,
Sure. Makes sense. If it's something that you see all the time and it's like, oh, it's just this crappy little bird, like, it's an eagle, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Right. And nothing about the central core part of the message is distorted because they don't have that association with doves anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question that we had here was, I've read the Helion is by far the longest preserved text in Old Saxon, but are there any interesting shorter stories or references to the pagan gods or Germanic heroes like Sigurður, Atli, Jormunrekkr, Þjóðrekkr, etc.?
Yeah. Good question. There is no mention in any Old Saxon text of any pagan hero or god, with one exception, right? There is a early 9th century baptismal vow in Old Saxon that mentions three gods. Mentions Thuner, right, which is Thor, right, thunder. Woden, which is Woden or Odin, and then a god called Saxnot, Saxnot, Saxnot. And this is the only reference to Saxnot. Nobody really knows who this is. The word sax goes back to a Germanic word for knife, right? Not would be related to modern standard German Genosse, companion. So companion of the knife, something like that. Perhaps a war god of some kind. There was I guess the god to whom this is most often related is someone like Tyr or Tuwas, right? The old god of war, I think that Odin supplanted in the course of the late antique period. You probably know more about this than me, or probably even some of the audience members. Um, and I do see that one of our viewers, Stella Nathaniel, shared the Old Saxon baptismal vow on YouTube. There's also a Wikipedia page for the Old Saxon baptismal vow, so you can easily find that. There's also a Wikipedia page on Saxnode, right? And so you can read some of the theories about Saxnode's origins. I mean, he could be a Saxon a god specific to the Saxons. He could be another god like Tyr or Tuwas, simply given another name. As you know, old Germanic poetry is filled with different sorts of names. I mean, how many names does Odin have in Old Norse literature, all the other gods? So he could simply be a god that we know about under a different name. But that would be the only Old Saxon text that transmit names from the pagan period. As for the heroes, there is a text in Old High German called the Hildebrandslied. There is a bit of an Old Saxon connection because a few of the words in that text, it's kind of a hybrid text, and a few of the words are either Old Saxon or Anglo-Saxon. And so there may be kind of an Old Saxon connection here. And this Hildebrandslied mentions people like Dietrich of Bern. That would be Theodoric. That would be the Germanic Theodoric later on. It mentions Odoaker. It mentions the king of the Huns. The name Atli or Etzel is not used, but the king of the Huns really can only be one person at that time. It mentions Hildebrand and Hadubrand. The Old High German Hildebrandslied has this kind of interesting hybridity between Christianity and paganism. On the one hand, there's the all-powerful God, the Waltand Gott, who's the Christian God. But what really determines the outcome of the action is not the God, but this force called Weihwurt, which is an evil fate, right? And the Hildebrandslied ended with the killing of the son by the father under conditions of having to maintain loyalty to one's lord. And so it ends in a very, very pagan fashion, absolutely not a Christian fashion. And so that would be a text. It's not a pagan text, really. It transmits a certain amount of the old pagan charisma, I would say, in a certain sense. And it does have a little bit of an Old Saxon, a few words. Maybe it was, maybe Old Saxon people could have understood it, or it was used in some way there. I don't know. But other than that, there are no other references to pagan names in the Old Saxon texts. The Old Saxon Genesis text that we were talking about a little bit earlier, there's one episode where, so in the story of Adam and Eve, the first part of the Old Saxon Adam and Eve story starts with Satan in hell. He's bound there and he can't come up. So he sends a demon. He sends a demon up to the Garden of Eden to do the tempting for him, right? And there's an episode where this demon girds himself with his weapons and his armor, and he puts on a helm of invisibility, right? A Helith helm, it's called. Now, that's right out of the Nibelungenlied or the Nibelung tradition, right? That's very much an artifact from Germanic heroic poetry. He puts on this Helith helm and he goes up there and he takes different shapes depending on who he's talking to. He talks to Eve, and then he talks to Adam, and then he talks to Eve. And so he's kind of, the helm was only mentioned in one line, but it's implicit that he's kind of, he puts on a very, very, he's not invisible either. It's kind of a shape-shifting sort of helmet. So that's a little element from Germanic heroic poetry imported into the biblical story to give it a kind of certain a familiarity to audiences who were used to dealing with the old poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Hildebrandslied is a really interesting one to mention too, just to go back to that for a moment. Wayward ski hit.
Right, exactly.
But it begins with the first line is basically Old Saxon, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Ich sagen, right?
Ich gehorte das Sagen, was sich urhet einen Woten Hildebrand und die Hadobrand und der Herien twain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that first line, exactly. That's Old Saxon, right?
Yeah, it's so there's been a lot of ink spilled about what exactly the origin of this is and why this hybrid of features is in there, and this
right.
And this one page that survives because it was used to bind something else, right?
Yeah, it appears on the front it's written in the margins of another text, Latin text, as most of these things uh, were. The Old Saxon Genesis fragments are a similar situation. The Heliand had its own manuscripts, but a lot of these things were just kind of jotted down in the interstices of Latin religious manuscripts. What was I going to say about the? Oh yeah, with the Hildebrand's Lied, when I teach a course called Germania, which is about Germanic Europe, and I spend a whole 2 weeks on the Hildebrand's Lied because this story of its origins is so interesting. I mean, the names Hildebrand and Hadubrand are Lombard in origin, so Germanic people settled in northern Italy, right? And so there's a very interesting connection to the ancient Lombards, right? And it seems to have come up through southern Germany, right? And then written down under very interesting circumstances in the Fulda Monastery sometime in the 9th century. Yeah.
Oh, I've always thought that was a particularly fascinating text. Another question we had was, did Old Saxon, as opposed to Old English, contribute anything to modern English?
You had sent this question earlier, and I could not find anything. I could not find anything where something made its way into the English language from Old Saxon, right? I couldn't find anything. Everything comes through Old English.
Yeah, it's so closely related too that, unlike with Old Norse, where there are a few really obvious isoglosses, the sh, ska thing that helps you find. I mean, I guess that's there in Old Saxon too, but I guess languages are so close that you would have a really hard time identifying that something was a borrowing from Old Saxon.
Right. Exactly.
And another question along those lines, sort of, at what point did the Saxons cease to be a uniquely identifiable people?
Yeah. Well, they never really did. I mean, Saxony is still a place in Germany today. There are place names that say Saxony, right? There are people who identify themselves as Saxons, right? There has been an identity associated with Saxony. There's been continuity there from this time, right? Now it has undergone many changes, right? And the biggest change was that Saxon identity simply became subsumed into Deutsch identity, probably sometime in the 9th and 10th centuries. Now, I noticed that you had a couple of podcasts recently about, what's the difference between German and Germanic, a very thwarted question in the English speaking world for reasons you laid out in those podcasts, right? It's a huge problem. You simply don't have that problem in German because everything associated with Germany, i.e. the modern ethnic identity as Germans and modern Germany, is simply Deutsch, and it's not Germanisch, right? And this word Deutsch comes into existence right at the time the Heliand is being written, right? In the 8th and 9th centuries, this word Deutsch arises, and what it does is it overlays all the regional identities. It is seen to umbrella them all, but in a way that these identities simply become sub-identities of Deutsch. And so you find texts throughout the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries that will say something like, yes, the German people, that is the Swabians and the Bavarians and the Saxons and the Franks, right? And that goes all the way through. The Saxon nobility is very, very powerful in the 9th and 10th centuries. A whole dynasty of German emperors comes from Saxons, right? That would be the Ottonians. In the 10th century, a monk named Widukind writes a history of the Saxon people, and he's very proud of the Saxon identity. And but of course, it's a German identity, right? So it never really. The identity of the Saxon people is simply subsumed into the German, but it never disappears.
And this may be a little bit of field, but it just strikes me out of curiosity. Do modern or recent writers of Plattdeutsch draw on Old Saxon or Old Saxon works as a inspiration or source?
That is a good question. I simply do not know. I do not know.
Because there is some linguistic continuity there between
Yeah,
Saxon and modern Plattdeutsch.
that's a good question. Many years ago, I made an effort to kind of learn a little bit of Plattdeutsch. I was in Germany and I was in Rostock and Berlin at various times, and I'd get texts and I'd read my way through them. And but I never really explored that question. I imagine that there would be somebody somewhere, but generally, there was this big reception of the Heliand in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it was pan-German, right? It was seen as, I don't know what individual reception would have gone on specifically having to do with this Low German aspect. That I don't know.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no flag behind it, so. But I mean, and some of that pan-German movement, I mean, embraced Old English and Old Norse stuff as being
Yeah.
part of that German identity. So.
Yeah, one of the Pike Spy points out here, Niedersachsen, Sachsen-Anhalt, and Sachsen. We have three of them now, right? Three territories in modern Germany that have this Saxon name in them. They all go back to early modern political formations, right? Ultimately back to the Duchy of Saxony, which I think was a 10th century founding, right? This is an aspect of, I mean, this goes all the way back to the mission history. I mean, the conversion of the Saxons was so difficult, and there was so much resistance for so long that Charlemagne just went out of his way to really, really make the Saxon nobility feel good, and he gave them positions of power, and he really co-opted them to the detriment of the lower classes, which led to this mid-9th century revolt. But yet, the Saxon nobility became very, very powerful from early on.
Hmm.
And he also points out modern Platt speakers probably wouldn't even know that they were supposed to be associated with Saxon. Yeah, I mean, the modern German, with the exception of Niedersachsen, Sachsen-Anhalt, and Saxon are much more to the east than early medieval Saxony. And this has to do with the fact that the Saxons, once they were converted to Christianity, they were the big impulse. They were the big. They did most of the staffing of the missionizing of the Saxons and the driving of the Slavs, mm-hmm. And the driving of the Slavs out of those territories in Germania at the time. Mm-hmm. Right? Is it very one thing about the mission there? The Saxon mission was very brutal, right? But once the Saxons were converted in the 9th century, it's very interesting. If you read not Widukind, but other authors who are of Saxon origin, they say things like, yeah, Charlemagne really kicked our butts, right? It was really, really hard, but it was necessary, right? Because it was necessary to become Christian. One phrase that you find in a couple of the missionary texts is Charlemagne preached with an iron tongue, right? And that was the brutality of the mission. But then these Saxon authors go on to say, yeah, and it was a good thing, and now we're going to do it to the Slavs, right? Because this is how it has to happen, right? So they kind of own that, the brutality. In the second and the third and the fourth generations, they kind of own the brutality of the conversion in a way that kind of makes them proud, right?
Yeah, and I mean, what a public relations stunt that is. Because, I mean, it as you well know, living in Athens, Georgia, the southern U.S. still has, the South will rise again people. There's never been, like, we were beaten, but we got beaten good. Like that's a major PR move.
Yeah, the Pike Spy writes here, second stage internalized imperialism. I love it. Yeah, I mean,
internalized imperialism. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and now we're gonna pass it on. But I guess part of it is like we're so tough. It took that to bring us.
Yes. In. Yeah. No, that's definitely definitely an aspect of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a feeling that was a big part of selling that. Another question here was, who was Ing and what does he have to do with the Saxons?
Yeah, I saw this, and I did discover in my research of this question that that Ing is a name that you find in Anglo-Saxon texts, and apparently it's listed among the names of pagan gods. I found very little discussion of this Ing. There's certainly no mention of an Ing. ING in an old Saxon text. So I don't really know what that is. The person who asked the question probably knows more than I do about this. Now there is a in the chronicle of the history of the Saxons by Widukind of Corvey, there is we learn about a hero named Iring, Iring, who is not a Saxon but a Thuringian, but he's involved in the conversion of the he's involved in kind of military confrontations between the Franks, the Thuringians, and the Saxons in the 7th century. And there's a very interesting story about Iring, which leads us to believe that there was originally a vernacular heroic poem, very much in the style of the Hildebrandslied, about this Iring character that is lost to history. It was never written down. We simply have this one little anecdote in Widukind, but I don't know any ing associated with Old Saxon.
I think maybe the idea is something to do with Ingvaeonic.
Yeah.
And of course, presumably
that would go back to Tacitus's names that he gives in his kind of mythological sketch of Germanic ancestry. But I don't know if there's any knowledge of that, or there's any evidence of. I mean, there's one manuscript, I think, of the Germania, which is in the monastery of Fulda, and it's used by 1 or 2 writers of text. But other than that, Tacitus is not really known until the early modern period, where he's kind of rediscovered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another question, and I think we've somewhat touched on this, but just see if you have something else you'd like to add. What sets Old Saxon apart from other contemporary Germanic languages? Does it have any features that are particularly innovative or conservative?
Yeah, the conservative features would be like non-participation in the Second Germanic sound shift that distinguishes it from Old High German. And what sets it apart from Old English would be things like the lack of the palatalization of these velar consonants. Like so, you'd have words like the initial ge of the verb forms, gekoran. Yeah, you'd have that yeah, that'd be that would be the palatalized in Old English. You'd have yeah, whereas you have g in Old Saxon, very much like modern Standard German, still have has these hard G's at the beginning. Or a word like kirk, right? Chiriche would be Old English. It would be kirk, forms of like kirk in Old Saxon. So it doesn't participate in either of those things. Now, other than that, it's very difficult to compare something like the lexicon, because we only have religious texts. We only have the gospel, and we have these Old Saxon Genesis texts, and there's nothing else. And so the vocabulary is just very, very limited. It's all told in this kind of elevated register of the heroic poetry that was a form of art developed among the nobility. Whereas in Old English, you have all kinds of texts. You have thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of all texts, very different sorts of historical texts. You've got heroic poetry, you've got sermons and things like that. All those texts are lacking in Old Saxon, and so we can't really compare how innovative the lexicon would have been. Mm-hmm. But it's generally quite conservative, I would say. And another thing is we have no Old Saxon disappears after the mid-9th century. There's nothing else written in it. And so we don't know how it developed, how it looked in the 11th and 12th centuries. And of course, a lot of the Old Norse texts are from the 11th and 12th centuries, so they're not really quite contemporary either.
Right. We have to look to runic text for the true contemporary.
Right.
True contemporary text. Is
generally a bit more conservative than either Old High German or Old English.
Yeah. And actually remind me if in the verb, if the plural has different forms for the different persons. Because in Old English, they all fall together.
I actually have to kind of look that up. These,
I was just thinking about this myself, because you don't see that in Old High German. You do see it in Old English. And I was wondering, I couldn't remember if Old Saxon went one way or the other way. Because Old Frisian goes with Old English.
Yeah. Apart from the irregular verbs, in the plural, though, frimity, subjunctive, Old English. I would need to kind of do a little bit of a dive into that question. I don't think so, though. In the plural, no, I think they're all the same. There's a leveling there.
Okay. Yeah, so that would be a common West Germanic thing outside of Old High German.
Yeah.
Um, and then
Uh,
so is Plattdeutsch not considered, or is any variety of Plattdeutsch not considered a descendant of Old Saxon? But we just don't have these sort of middle forms until we get to Middle Low German.
yeah, I think it is. I don't know what else it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just
Um,
thinking about as far as continuity goes, uh, where the language of a place like Lübeck in the Middle Ages would be, you know, Old Saxon 5, 6 centuries later. Uh,
that is a good question. I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of other influences, especially in those littoral regions, right? I don't know. I don't want to. I don't want to. That's just so not my thing. So I don't
no,
really
for
know.
sure.
Yeah,
Not trying to put you on the spot.
that's
Uh,
okay.
one more question from the prepared questions that were sent earlier. Could you read us something in Old Saxon
Yeah.
to give us a feel for the language?
Now I did prepare a little bit just from the beginning of the text, and I made a document here which I could share
Of course,
if I
let me
if I
make
could
you.
do a screen share.
Yeah, I've made you co-host just now, so you should be able to share.
Let's see here. Where is that?
It's usually down at the middle. Yeah, looks like you found it.
Let me. Okay. Um, this is right at the beginning of the text. So I will read this.
So I see just a file folder.
Okay,
That,
you don't.
that I
You're
can.
not seeing.
I don't see the document itself that you're
Let's see
trying
the
to.
document itself. Huh? It's showing here. It says your screen sharing is paused. Let me stop share and reshare here.
Yeah,
Now,
sometimes you have to click on that particular window you want to share. This, by the way, I get tripped up by this all the time. Zoom is not super intuitive about how to make this work. There we
how's
go.
that? Is that
Perfect.
it?
Yep.
Okay.
I see it down to Firiho Barno Frumion.
Yeah, I will move it up.
Okay.
So it's just the first 19 lines. Manige waarom, für sie ihre Mut gespoon, that sie begonnen rekian that geruni, that sie rikio Christ under man kunnea, mare that gefrumede, mit Wordung, endi mit Werkung. That wolde tho, wisere philo liudo barno lovon, lera Christes, helach word Godas. Endi mit ihro handon skrivan berechtlico an buog, huo sia is gebotsgips golden frummian, virigo barn. Than waren thoch sia fiori, te thiu unter thermenigo, thia habdon macht Gottes, helpa van himmela, helachna geest, kraft van Christe. Sia wurfon gekorana, te thio that sia van evangelion, einan skoldon an buog skrivan. Endi so manach gebot Gottes, heilach himmelis wort. Sia nimwos de heliddodd an mer, virgo barno frumian. Nieuwan that sia fiori te theo. Entschuldigung, nieuwan that sia fiori te theo through kraft Godas gekorana wupthon. Matthäus en die Marcus, so waren die man hetana. Lucas en die Johannes.
Spectacular reading.
So just a couple of features. One thing, this word here, geruni, right? The biblical message is seen in terms of secret runes, right? This is the rune word here, right? That's interesting there. That's that kind of stylizes the gospel as secret lore, right? And also the way that the poet here describes the gospel writers as being privy to this secret knowledge that only they are empowered by God to transmit. That's also, this is kind of a lends a certain kind of mystique to the gospel message in terms of like ancient lore and things like that. I think that also would have been an accommodation mechanism to the immediately post-pagan audience there.
Mhm. Well, that was a wonderful reading. I
Can I
forgot.
let me just with regard to that, let me I have recorded quite a bit of the I need to reshare again. I have recorded quite a bit of the Heliond. I have a site here. Let me reshare. Sorry, I de-shared and now I need to reshare here. Let me just show this to your
That's right.
audience.
Yeah, people are going to want to see this. And I was wondering if we haven't taken too much of your time, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Old Saxon Genesis.
Yeah, just a second here. I have a site. I haven't updated it in a long time, but it is various kinds of. Oh, I
I
see
don't
it
know what that was. It showed for a moment. Maybe just click
now,
back.
and now it says it can't be found. The IP address. I will. I'll put the. I'll put the link in the.
That
In
was
the
strange.
chat. In
It
the
showed
chat.
for
It's
Stella just put it in. I see it.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Stella. You can find recordings of all different kinds of, mostly Middle High German. That's my real specialization is Middle High German. So the language of Germany from about 1100 through about 1300. But there is about 1/4 of the Heliond in there, including some of the more charismatic episodes in terms of this question of the legacy, the ancient Germanic legacy. There, and you can find that there. So you can find recordings of all that.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
looking at the links right now that Stella shared, and it's working for me. So I'm not
yeah,
sure what happened.
yeah. The Hildebrandslied is there too, as well as the Muspeli. I believe I recorded the Muspeli at your request many years ago. You were in a class by Wisconsin, right? And and you wrote to
Yeah,
me, "Can
I
you
think,
record this?" And I was like, "All right, let me throw it up there."
yeah, I think that was my Old High German class there with Joe Salmons.
Yeah.
That sounds
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
that's it. That's it. Yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff at that site. Again, I haven't recorded anything in a long time. I do plan on getting back to it eventually. But let me talk to you a little bit about the Old Saxon Genesis. Yeah. So this is a text. We don't know whether it was written before or after the Heliond. Most people think it was written after the Heliond. We don't know whether it was written by the same poet or a group of poets. It seems to stylistically a little bit different than the Heliond. It takes a little bit more liberties with the the material that theologically, that's actually what I've written about. I've kind of worked on theological questions that could, however, have to do with the fact that it's a bit more narrative. I mean, the Heliond itself, it tells the story of Jesus, and of course, there are narrative elements to that, but mostly it's just Jesus talking. So, for example, the Sermon on the Mount accounts for, I think, 1/8 of the text in the Heliond of the 6,000 lines. I mean, it's a very, very long section, and that underscores the importance of the moral message of the gospel, right? The Genesis fragments are a bit more narrative, and they tell the story quite differently than it is in the Bible. There are 3 short fragments. There's the Adam and Eve story, the temptation in the garden. That's the first one. There's the story of the killing of Abel by Cain. That's the second one. And the third one is the escape by Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom. Now, the Helion preface says that the poet that was commissioned to write these texts told the whole story of the Old and the New Testaments. And so we don't know whether these are these are only 3 surviving fragments of a much larger whole that has been lost to history, or whether in fact it was simply maybe there was very little more written at the time, right? The story of Adam and Eve tells the story of how the devil was very upset that God had replaced him and decides to destroy the relationship between God and his protoplast, right? His creation. And so he goes up there, he sends this devil up there to tempt Adam and Eve. And there's a long interview with Adam initially, which is not in the Bible. In the Old Saxon Genesis, the devil first comes and he's got his helm of disguise on, so he appears very nice, a nice guise, and he says, "I'm a messenger from God, and he wants you to eat this apple as a sign of his loyalty." And Adam's like, "Well, God didn't say anything about that, right? I don't want to do that, right? So I'm we'll see about that. He rejects the temptation. Then the devil goes to Eve and manages to tell her that unless she eats this apple, her posterity, her children are going to be endangered, and Adam and God are really having a fight right now, and she needs to mediate. So this kind of peace weaver kind of discourse gets in there, and she eats the apple and has a vision, and then Adam comes and reprimands her. And then she's very penitent at that point. And she says, gosh, I really screwed things up. What can I do to make it better? And that's also a major change from the Bible. This is one of the things that I've argued about, is that, if you remember from the Bible, when God comes down to the Garden of Eden after they've eaten the fruit, right, they are not penitent. They're like, oh, Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent. And then God gets really mad, right, because they're not taking responsibility for what they did. I argue that the real problem, that Genesis, the Old Saxon Genesis, attempts to kind of turn Adam and Eve into penitent figures as a way of de-emphasizing their sin, right? And it's Cain and Abel. It's Abel, sorry, Cain, who really transmits, in my view, the awfulness of the sin in killing Abel. That's a blood crime. That is something that at that point the narrator says, and the horrific nature of this crime transmits itself down through the generations. And so original sin is much more closely linked to Cain's crime than the fruit issue back in the first story. And then the third fragment, Lot and his family escape from the destruction of Sodom, and it ends with Lot's wife looking back and turning into a pillar of salt, right? And I've not yet published on this fragment. I would love to. The way I read that figure is Lot's wife is looking back to the ancient pagan past and kind of wanting to go back there, right? Very much like generations of Saxons thought they could return to the old ways. They revolted against Charlemagne. So maybe Lot's wife is a figure for the desire to return to the pagan past. I just haven't found any concrete references in theological texts to Lot's wife being discussed in that particular way. I would love to find a passage. I haven't yet. Lot's wife is oftentimes used in the theological criticism as a way of, returning to a bad old tradition. I just haven't found any. I would love to find a specific reference to Lot's wife in the theological literature from Saxony at that time, and I haven't done it yet. But yeah.
Well, and that's very, very compelling what you say about original sin being more associated with Cain and Abel. A bigger deal, frankly, than someone eating an apple, it seems like. So
in the comments, the viewer Jay says, sounds familiar with Grendel descending from Cain and Beowulf. I make this point in an article I've written. I can send links to my stuff to your audience there, but that's exactly correct. Yeah.
Yeah, please. And I'll, if you have some articles you particularly like linked below the public video, just send them to me. I'll put them in a pinned comment or something like that.
Yeah. I made a little page on my blog to just some links about, let's see here. Well, I'm not going to, I'll just send you the link.
Stella pointed out that if you type not sagamara.com, but sagamara.libsyn.com.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That would be, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, I put together just a little page on the Heliand is very easy to find in English translation. The Old Saxon Genesis texts are not easy to find in Old English translation, and modern English translation.
Old or modern, because there is an Old English, right?
Yeah, in modern English translation. So I put together a page of links that I will send you. Here, let me just put it in the. I'll put it in the. Oh, wait a minute. I haven't actually posted it to my blog yet, but I will soon. Maybe I should. If you can wait just a second, I'll do it. It won't take but a second. Post
live blog editing.
Go ahead. Any more questions?
Yeah, I was going to say if you would take time, would you take a few live here?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Jazz says, could the emphasis on the slaying of Abel as original sin come from a cultural taboo and killing blood relatives, like in the Norse sagas, where killing a family member is the most tragic thing someone could do?
Let's see. I don't know. It would be, let me think about that for just a second here. Here's my blog. Possibly. But if you're telling the story of Adam and Eve and their immediate descendants, there are no people around who are not relatives. And so it would be difficult to isolate that aspect of the story and claim that the author is making a point about the killing of blood relatives, because there are no more people around at the time. Another thing about that particular fragment is that the immediate the killing of Cain of Abel by Cain is not actually shown in the story, right? The text, I mentioned these are fragments. The text picks up immediately after the killing. We don't actually see the killing. Now, in the article that I published on this, I argued that this was perhaps a deliberate choice, as a way of avoiding what I would call a kind of a avoiding representing a violent scene as a way of inculcating the message that we need to turn away from violence. Maybe, this episode with Simon Peter, there was an attempt to kind of, there was kind of an indulgence in the warrior rage there, right? But that may have kind of sent the wrong message in a certain sense, and in not showing. Go ahead.
I was going to say the poet's trying not to be Terminator 2.
Yes, yeah. So he deals, the Cain fragment deals with the immediate consequences of the killing, but it doesn't actually show the killing itself, possibly intentionally.
Yeah.
But the message about violence, it's very much a universal message against violence as a way of settling disputes of any kind, right? Be they among blood relatives or anybody else. And the way that violence is talked about in the Heliand is not restricted to blood relatives. There's no distinction made in that case.
I think it's really compelling. I mean, I joke Terminator 2 comes to mind because it's such a violent movie with this premise of like, but violence isn't the answer.
Yeah.
After you've watched 2 hours of wild violence.
Right, exactly. Yeah. There's always, I also make this point in that article that there's a way of, you're undermining your own message, I think, with even in the act of representation, just in the simple act of representation, you are possibly countering your own message.
Right. But of course, I mean, some of this can be just different levels of sophistication on the part of the poets, where poets aren't going to even know how to not talk about this.
Right. No, that's true. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, especially if you're talking about kind of this oral tradition, right? I mean, you get certain type scenes going, right? And they kind of they compose themselves in a certain sense. I mean, totally. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that has to have been part of the challenge for these people.
Yeah.
You see a little bit of this, of a like challenge highlighted in Hallfreðr Saga Vandra the Skalds in Norse. Hallfreðr, the trouble poet, converts to Christianity at the insistence of his lord, King Olafur Tryggvason of Norway, and then like really struggles to compose Skaldic poetry.
Yeah.
Because all of it is built on all of these pagan allusions.
Yeah. Right.
J.S., do you have a good book recommendation for trying to read Heliand in the original?
Let me before I answer this question, let me just follow up on one thing you just said, which is, after the Heliand and after the Old Saxon Genesis, this whole literature vanishes completely. It has no successors. And one of the theories about that is that simply the act of invoking this kind of language, using the vernacular in this particular way, right? This heroic alliterative verse, irrespective of the message, may have transmitted too much of what the cultural establishment, the missionary establishment, wanted to leave behind, right? Even though the Christian message is transmitted in a very orthodox way, simply the use of this kind of language in this kind of way was enough to maybe send bad vibes out, right? Right. And so there's nothing that follows on this, right? It was we have no evidence of how it was received, how the text was received. It's just right there, right? And that's all there is. So that may be evidence that, well, it served its maybe a purpose, or maybe didn't serve its purpose all that well. I mean, it did survive in several manuscripts, so it was quite successful. But between the 9th century and then Martin Luther, who did use it to say, hey, look, the Bible was translated in a Germanic language. And so therefore that legitimizes what I'm doing in the early 16th century.
Huh.
Between those centuries, that's all there is.
I didn't know that Luther explicitly called out the
Yeah.
Heliand. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that anyone would think about it in that time period. That's fascinating.
Well, he was, as you and your listeners may know, I mean, the vernacular translation of the Bible was very carefully guarded by the church, right? They didn't want translation circulating because that called into question their monopoly over interpretation. And so what Luther was doing was saying, look, there is a tradition of vernacular Bibles, right? It begins very early. Look at this, right?
I mean, certainly it makes perfect sense. I didn't know that. How cool. Any other?
So Jay says, do you have a good book recommendation for trying to read the Helion in its original language? Yes, I do. A very good book, and it's still in print, is this one.
Let's see if it'll show up. There we go. Yeah, Kathy's, right? Cathey.
Yeah, I believe I have a link. Yeah, it's well, I won't let me
I've got it on my bookshelf too.
I'll take my back.
Wow, you just came forward 1,000 years.
Is that backwards or is that?
No, I see it. I see it right. Yeah, James Cathey. CH.
This is a nice book. This doesn't have the whole text. It's got episodes, but it has a language primer. It has episodes that are broken down with full vocabulary given. And so when I teach this language, I teach it occasionally to an individual student. This is the book that I order, and we work through the language and the episodes there. So this is a good one.
It's very good. I agree. And then thank you also for sharing all the other links on your site there. That link did work.
Good. Yeah.
And Stella just shared a link to Kathy's book. If anyone is looking for that. Cool. Oh, and you can even get a PDF of it now. Nice.
Oh, wow. Fabulous. Yeah.
Any other questions from our live audience? Questions or
remarks? Do you mind if I ask out loud or?
Yes.
I mean, do you mind or yes, is it okay?
Sorry. I do not mind. Please do.
Okay, I've just been, since you've kept referring to me as the Pike Spy, it's kind of hard for you to realize we've corresponded before. I'm Adrian. I'm the Middle High German guy.
Oh wow, yes. Hi.
I'm sorry that I'm crashing the video. You can cut this out afterwards. But the question I think I've asked it to Dr. Crawford a year ago when we first planned the interview, but our ever reliable Wikipedia says that apparently that Old Saxon was written with runes at some point, but do we have any attestations of runic writing in Old Saxon?
I do not believe so. I have here what is it? I have this book here by a gentleman named Gerhard Köbler called Sammlung aller altsächsischen Texte. So a collection of all texts in Old Saxon.
That's online too, I think.
Herr Köbler strikes again.
Yeah, I don't find any runic in this. I'm not familiar with any runic inscription that appears in Old Saxon that we can definitively say is Old Saxon. I mean, apart from the Heliand and the Old Saxon Genesis and the baptismal formula, pretty much in a few other things, administrative things, markers of territories and things like that. It's mostly interlineal glosses in Latin texts with lists of Old Saxon words, but there's no, I don't think there's any runic inscriptions at all. And I know of none that survive from Saxonia or Saxon countries in the early Middle Ages that we can say this is Old Saxon. Da bin ich überfragt. I think, are you German?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you?
No, I'm not.
I'm wondering.
I'm from Ohio.
Your pronunciation is very crisp. Your reading of the Heliand was exceptionally beautiful, if I may say
thank
so.
You. I appreciate that. Thank you.
It really was. And it's great that you make available more of that audio on your website.
Yeah, I did a lot of recording. I just, I became department head, and then I just haven't returned. I had a young son at the time who was making a lot of noise in the house where my studio was, and so I just haven't gotten back to it. But I do plan on doing it at some point. I'm not sure I'll finish the whole Heliand, but I do want to read some more Middle High German stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, we need to have you back to talk about. I mean, maybe we could talk about some Middle High German stuff. Like
Sure, the Nibelungenlied. I'm always happy to talk about that. Again, I've not published anything on the Nibelungenlied, but actually one thing, but I teach it all the time, and it's a wonderful text. I mean, it's a totally unique text. It starts something in medieval Germany, which lasts. Then it revives this Germanic tradition, which had died out in Germany. I mean, it was gone, right? The Carolingians and the successors were so effective in eradicating the pagan Germanic, the heroic Germanic, much more so than the Scandinavian world, that it was gone from literary culture up until right around 1200, when the Nibelung poet set this thing out there, and it completely took the cultural establishment by storm. We know that. So it's a very interesting hybrid text between the Germanic and the courtly in a way that is lovely to talk about. And you can find wonderful translations of it. At Hackett, as you know, put out a translation that we've talked about recently that I've taught now. So I'd be happy to talk about Middle High German. We could center that on the Nibelungenlied and talk about anything else that you and the audience wanted to.
I think it sounds great. Let's arrange it for a time that'd be convenient for you.
Okay.
For now, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have you on, and I'll look forward to next time.
Thanks for all the great questions. I know the Pike's Spy, Adrian, I do owe you a reply at some point to your last post. I think the ball is in my court on that. I will now that I've met you in person, virtually, I will try to get on that. So.
It's no worries. I know. I always tell all the linguistic, or rather language people I meet, I don't mind if it takes a long time to respond. I know you people have actual jobs and important things to attend to. I'm always waiting,
It's
like
great
in a positive sense. Like I'm always happy to wait for a response.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. It's great, Jackson, to reconnect with you and to participate in this wonderful thing you have going on here, to be a little part of that. It's an honor.
Thank you so much. An honor likewise. And in person, virtually, wishing you all the best.
All right.